My name is Natasha Myers. I teach in the departments of Anthropology and Science and Technology Studies here at York University, and it is such a pleasure to welcome Charis Thompson here to York University to give this public lecture, which is an opening to a two-day workshop that we're holding called The Politics of Care in Technoscience. In a moment, Anna Vizol will join us to introduce Charis Thompson, and we'll have a couple of comments from and welcomes from other people. But I'd like to welcome you on behalf of my collaborators, Anna Vizol and Aaron Martin, who we've been working together for years, and thrilled, in a sense, to be able to host this event, one in which has been in the making for quite some time. In fact, since we've sort of converged here collectively. The theme that we're grappling with here today is the politics of care in technoscience, and it's a theme that has been the center of feminist research in science and technology studies and many other disciplines. One of the questions we're raising here is how to care and how to care well, and we're inspired by the work of Maria Puig de la Bellacasa in this formation. The question is not just about how care is actualized in practices in the fields of science, technology, and medicine, but it is also about raising questions about the problems and possibilities of care as a research modality. And here we're thinking about a feminist praxis of care. And I know that Professor Charis Thompson's talk today will give us an opportunity to think much more deeply along these lines. At this point, I would like to extend our thanks to the generosity of our sponsors and those whose caring labors has made this event possible. First, our thanks to our primary funder, the Situating Science Shirk Cluster Strategic Knowledge Grant, and Emily Tector, who is here, who has given us incredible support. Thank you so much, Emily, for that. We also want to thank Barbara Crow, the Associate Dean of Research in the Faculty of Liberal Arts and Professional Studies, Lisa Phillips, Associate Vice President of Research and Innovation, Bernie Lightman from the Institute of Science and Technology Studies, and Albert Squires and David Skinner, who chairs the Departments of Anthropology and Communications, for their generous contributions and support. Last but not least, I want to acknowledge the unwavering support and amazing labor that Alistair McMillan and Cameron Murray have put in. They're PhD candidates in the in the Institute for Science and Technology Studies in the graduate program, and they've been giving us an amazing amount of support throughout this. So we wanted to thank them, and they're not even in the room right now. They're so busy doing amazing work. So we will thank them later. Professor Thompson's lecture will be followed today by responses by Aaron Martin and Anna Vizol. So we'll have an opportunity after that to open up to much more dialogue and engagement collectively among the group. And for now, I'd like to introduce Bernie Lightman to offer a welcome from the Institute for Science and Technology Studies. Bernie, that would be great.
I'm going to be quick because I really am anxious to hear Professor Thompson. Good afternoon to all of you, and I'm here to represent two of the sponsors of Professor Thompson's talk today and of the workshop that will take place over the weekend. So first I want to welcome you all on behalf of Situating Science, which is a 7-year project promoting communication and collaboration among humanists and social scientists engaged in the study of science and technology. Situating Science, for those of you who don't know much about it, was created in 2007 with the generous funding of the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. And we've been very lucky here at York to be designated as one of the nodes of the network. We've benefited tremendously from this connection, and one of the fruits of the benefit is this workshop and this talk today. And second, I want to welcome you on behalf of York's Institute for Science and Technology Studies, which shares many of the aims of Situating Science. ISTS is devoted to research on how science and technology have shaped and how it continues to shape our world. Its researchers apply the methods and theories of the social sciences and the humanities to understand science, past and present. And over 20 York faculty are part of this vibrant institute, a significant number of which are engaged in the study of feminism and STS. So again, welcome to all of you, and I look forward to Professor Thompson's talk.
Hi, well, welcome to friends, guests, and colleagues, and Professor Thompson here to York University. I'm here in an official capacity to represent Dean Singer, who of the Faculty of Liberal Arts and Professional Studies, and I would not be remiss if I didn't relay his usual comments about our faculty. We are currently the size of the 5th largest university in Ontario with 25,000 undergraduates, 5,000 graduate students, 600 faculty. It's just incredible the size of our faculty with 21 academic units, 4 colleges, and 71 programs. So you can just imagine what kind of interdisciplinarity and kinds of research go on here. So I would like to speak to, aside from the colleagues who are presenting and engaging in research today on matters of technoscience, we have a number of other researchers at York University who have been doing some very interesting work. Professor Jody Berlin's work in the humanities, in particular her Digital Menageries project, which is looking at the relationship between animals, mobile technologies, and consumption and consumer practices. Professor Gwen Dobie's research in sustainable theater, where she's using digital media and movement technologies on how to create aspects of insectness with authenticity and engaging ways. It's a fascinating project. Our Canada Research Chair, Rosemary Coombe, has been working long and hard, diligently on an art mob software to engage with matters of intellectual property and digital archives that are going to become increasingly important as we move more into digital media around our research. And finally, the techno salons that have been organized by Natisha Myers and Michelle Murphy that have been very important in addressing interdisciplinary matters pertaining to technoscience that have been happening, trying to bring together a Toronto community, and it's been a really fascinating. If any of you can get to a techno salon, it's really interesting what they're trying to do there. They'll be writing about the techno salon a couple of decades from now. And that's my official welcome from York University. In my unofficial capacity as Barbara Crow, I'm very pleased to have been actually invited to participate in this conference. And in the fall, I was also extended an invitation to participate on contextualizing health information communication technologies, an interdisciplinary national workshop to explore the intersections of ICTs, Aboriginal health, and identity. And this conference was organized by Cynthia Alexander at Mount Allison and Professor Naomi Adelson, who's here today, and one of her papers is going to be. And I think that this there's very important relationships between the work that happened there and the kinds of issues that are being taken up here. I would argue that care was fundamental and at the core of that workshop. And the important kind of considerations and a reminder of time, space, and place, and to thank the Mississauga of the New First First Nation, whose lands we are to settle today, and that was a very important part of acknowledging where we were and who we were and what we were apart. Finally, what is most appealing to me about this workshop is its intergenerationality, a commitment to junior, mid-career, and senior scholars. And I view this as an important part of continuity and care. I look forward to this evening and this weekend as we experience, engage, think through, and inhabit theorizing and act in care in feminist matters of technoscience. So welcome.
And finally, I will introduce Professor Charis Thompson, and I'll start by saying that we're really, really, really happy to have her here. Professor Thompson is a professor in the Department of Gender and Women's Studies. She's also the Associate Director of Science, Technology and Society Center, both at Berkeley. Prior to that, she was at Harvard. And one of the things she does, which I find really exciting, is that she runs a web resource on gender and science. So for those of us who are interested in these matters, this is important. And in 2005, she wrote, actually, I think it was 2004, right, that the book came out, Making Parents? 2005. In 2005, she wrote a book that I absolutely love called Making Parents, that later went on to win the Rachel Carson Award from the Society for Social Studies of Science. And if you haven't read it, you should. It's really a great book. And she's now working, and that's what she will talk to us about. She's now working on a new book, which is forthcoming, and it's called Good Science, Vital Ethics at the End of the Beginning of Human Pluripotent Stem Cell Research. So we look forward to that, and most of all, we look forward to the talk now. So thank you.
Good afternoon. It's It's lovely to be here. It's lovely to have come from Europe for once instead of the other side of the United States of America and have jet lag in my favor. Thank you to the organizers for this conference. If there's anyone here who won't be staying for the 3 days, it's a tremendous shame because the papers are absolutely wonderful. And every aspect of the organization actually has been really great. So congratulations. Thank you all, congratulations. So I'm going to plunge straight in. I've done something which is rather uncaring, which is that I've changed the title of my talk. I changed the title of my book. Okay. When I finally finished my corrections, the title came out different. So now it has ethical choreography in it rather than vital ethics in it. Anyways, I changed the title of my talk so the people who are going to be so generously commenting at the end are commenting on a draft which is not the paper I'm going to be reading. So I'm really sorry about that. But anyway, I say in my defense I didn't realize I was pre-circulating, but still, I'm really sorry. Okay, so the paper is called The Politics of Care, Triage and Reciprocity in Biomedical Donation. It's exciting to be part of a workshop decrying the opposition of the concept of care to the economy, to technology, to cures, to the material in understanding technoscience. And I'd like to begin by thanking Anna Vizu, Erin Martin, and Natasha Myers for inviting me and for conceptualizing this event. I read the fantastic set of papers by the contributors, most by scholars whose work I've been learning from for years, but some with which this was my first interaction. And I'm going to use Karen Barard's word interaction throughout this talk because I think it's very apt here, with great anticipation for the next few days. The organizers of this weekend's conference have emphasized the importance of thinking about care in one's own research practices and commitments, as well as care as a more or less normative or descriptive term in the technosciences with which we work. In this paper, I shall briefly consider care in feminist science and technology studies as method and epistemology, and then turn to a case study of care as part of an alternative to a dominant paradigm of so-called donation in the use of tissue, cells, and organs in biomedicine, drawn from my forthcoming book, With Science. The last 2 decades have seen a plethora. Maybe I can. How would I move these slides on? I can. Thank you. Yes, maybe I'll do that. Yeah, thank you. Have seen a plethora of important work on care. I came of age academically in the 1990s when feminist technoscience studies drew on and contributed to feminist epistemology, such as Lorraine Coates' What Can She Know?, to insist on Donna Haraway's Situated Knowledges as antidote to dangerous fictions of disembodied and unaccountable knowers and makers of value-neutral knowledge and technology and ontologically severed subjects and objects. Lorraine Coates, in her paper for this conference, illustrates that these issues have not gone away, as she dissects the way that caring and advocacy of all kinds get lumped together and are ripe for framing as incompatible with expertise and truth-speaking. Post-colonial studies of modern science at the time, such as Shiv Vishwanathan's Carnival for Science, were equally critical of a vivisectionist, triaged history and epistemology of research and science. Care had been proposed as a beneficial epistemological affect in a man's world of life science in a slightly earlier instantiation of feminist studies of science, providing a putatively feminist feeling for the organism. Situated Knowledges ontologized care, and in doing so diffused and diffracted the ontology of knower and know. Situated Knowledges made it clear that while care might make epistemology and ontology more accurate, and might often do so precisely by admitting into the equation all the neglected things, Maria's expression, left out by power structures in which dominant knowledge practices emerged, it was not and had never been an innocent concept for feminist theory. Caring was, as Carla Hustek and Natasha Myers put it, an affectively charged mode of attention. I love that expression. In which the researcher and her topics of study interact in the world to co-produce the world. As such, it is a way to know the world better. In her paper, Situated Neuroscience, Elucidating a Biology of Diversity, feminist neuroscientist Gillian Einstein worked with the women in her study to refine the questions and goals of her study and to develop acceptable testing methods in her work with Somali Canadians on female genital cutting. The study generated information about the adult female brain and its relations to embodiment that would not have been askable or answerable using more conventional methods. Good science, as well as good ethics, required that kind of care. Caring brought to light that things, objects, subjects, big, small, matter, but caring did not make it all right. Indeed, care came with its own burdens. Recent transnational feminist studies of care work have dug deeply into the work of caring. Evelyn Nakano-Glenn's 2010 book, Forced to Care, showed that the concept of care functions to allow work to be privatized, rendered natural for reasons of kinship or dependence or appropriate feminized affect, and allows paid care work through analogization with unpaid care and slavery to be underpaid and stripped of workplace protections. For this conference, Annette Burfoot reminds us how nigh impossible it can be in the world of science funding to resist the opposition between research for a cure, which should be funded, and care, which should not, as if somehow they were opposed. Glenn showed that care work is frequently coercive, enshrines logics of race, class, and gender, and was integral to the rise of capitalism and the modern nation state, especially the United States of America. Rachel Pereñas and Eileen Boris's recent collected volume, Intimate Labors, which you may know, demonstrates the oxymoronic but essential elisions between various kinds of intimate work, and there are chapters from selling gametes in gender-appropriate ways, to doing nails in a nail salon, to being a Vietnamese hostess in a Japanese bar, and economic globalization with its own patterns of economic violence and raced and gendered migrations. Recent work in disability studies has criticized the concept of care for evoking charity and classed, raced, ableist maternalisms and paternalisms, for the hidden harms that can be done by excessively privatized care, and for linguistically casting people with personal assistance into a dependent relationship, and thus risking denying them the language and logic of interdependence. The work of Christine Kelly, for example, has called for a reworking of feminist deployments of the concept of care, and asked for the concept of care to be unsettled, as Michelle Murphy puts it, by disability studies work to promote the autonomy of those receiving frequently inadequate care and simultaneously protect caregivers. From a different angle, Myra Hurd's work pushes us to learn how to care for landfill waste against an ontology of forgetting the materialities of our wasteful ways, and amidst temporal and material scales in which human action is causally puny relative to the bio-geohistories of geological time. These perspectives unsettle any straightforward solace that might be sought in the affective, immanent, human content of caring. How then to begin this talk with and about care? The most important thing, perhaps, is never to lose sight of the coercive, maternalistic, paternalistic, humanist, gendered, classed, raced, occupying, ableist, stratifying legacies of care, even while insisting on a non-innocent epistemology and ontology of care. And I just picked a word for each of the papers I had just talked about there. Brian Campbell Smith, a philosopher and author of the forthcoming God Approximately, has said that what it is to believe is to find the world significant. For my working definition today, I shall consider that what it is to care about X, approximately, is to find X significant. And just a little aside, my 11-year-old thinks God Approximately is the best book title ever invented. Okay, triage, topologies of differentiated care. What happens to feminist STS varieties of care, in addition to always already being non-innocent, when the knowledges in question are poorly situated? In my book, Making Parents, the Ontological Choreography of Reproductive Technologies, I worked primarily ethnographically. Many of the sites I worked at for this project on stem cell and related technologies are shared with my earlier work on reproductive technologies. Indeed, I began studying stem cell research because eggs and embryos were essential raw materials to the field in the beginning. Certain IVF clinics where I was working literally became procurement stations. My previous concern with the disposition, circulation, and capitalization of ex vivo embryos and gametes thus intensified with this stem cell research. At the same time, the fields of human embryonic stem cell research and reproductive technologies quickly proved surprisingly different, despite enduring links. The researchers, research subjects, and research beneficiaries promoters and naysayers of one field were not the same or treated in the same way as those of the other field. And notably, the body of work on stem cell research in the social sciences is considerably less feminist than the body of work on reproductive technologies. I began the research for the new book by following and participating in these debates with an ethnographer's and participant observer's orientation to the thick present. When I began the project, thus, I filed for human subjects permission to carry out interviews and ethnography in pre-given sites. I'm super fast at doing it now. I can write all the risks and benefits and everything really quickly. This process required that I specify my subject populations and their degree of vulnerability. There's an easy one. As well as my sites and my recruitment efforts, another ghastly phrase. I quickly put aside this protocol, and I got the human subjects permission, but I quickly put aside this protocol. I wanted data from sites and subjects whose identities were appearing only as events unfolded. The people I originally intended to interview came to mind because they had already taken a position or were positioned by their medical condition vis-a-vis stem cell research, and frequently because of the fight over stem cell research, and especially in California at the time because of Proposition 71, had an interest in persuading me and others of their position. Something was missing in this way of proceeding. For example, it felt like important data that the general public, a terrible expression masking all kinds, were key to the story about the making of the populist California Stem Cell Initiative, Proposition 71, and its comfortable majority. And yet when I began working on stem cell education, members of the public in California were routinely cast as chronically ignorant, as chronically knowing too little about the science of stem cell research, what we sometimes refer to as the one-way deficit model of the public understanding of science. And public engagement tended to mean subjecting various audiences to stem cell education efforts by those representing institutions carrying out research, usually couched in language of much greater certainty than scientists used among themselves, as early work in STS noted. How could stem cell research hinge on the democratic wisdom of the people and widespread ignorance be imputed to the public at one and the same time? Similarly, my IRB-approved questions, how do you feel about egg donation for stem cell research? Do you think it is acceptable to use a leftover embryo from an IVF clinic for stem cell research? Began to seem like someone else's project. Still good questions, but someone else's project. Meanwhile, I found my project focusing more and more on terrible interview questions. Terrible because I did not want to know how an individual would answer them, but instead wanted to follow the questions themselves, such as, why is California acting like a nation? Why does no ethics work happen in an ethics committee? What are the dual use implications of these technologies? How can you ask the public to pay for this and then not guarantee that they'll benefit from the stem cell therapies? And answers from those that I had not solicited for interviews gave to my erstwhile interview questions. I increasingly found that I wanted to capture the parameters of what were, from my perspective, evolving, fractured, competing, animating scripts of an evolving, fractured, competing, whatever field. If reproductive technologies have always played out in ways that throw light on political debates of the day, so you can kind of go inside them and find the debates of the day, while themselves being more part of people's private lives and the private sector for all kinds of important reasons, human embryonic stem cell research emerged in the US as political debate of the day. On the right, it arose as already political because of the abortion issue. On the left, various self-styled progressives, several strongly allied with President Obama's administration and its regulatory and bioethical bodies, today strongly allied with that, and others prominent and progressive civil society groups, sought actively during this period to present a bioethical left that was also part of political culture and debate. Stem cell research in the US then was from a start a salvo in national and international political debate on innovation and abortion and competition in ways that were overdetermined and undersituated. In a different chapter of the Good Science book, I have little tables where I count how many times Obama and Bush used different words. And it turns out the main word that's different, they both say science and research just exactly the same number of times, well, same percentage of times as each other. The words that are different is Bush, this won't surprise you, well, probably neither of these will surprise you, says life a whole bunch more. And Obama says work a whole bunch more. It probably doesn't surprise you at all, but in fact there's an enormous amount there in exactly how these life sciences are positioned that you can get just from that one little piece of quantitative data. The task of compiling and processing my archive required new practices to augment the fieldwork that had previously formed the bedrock of my technical practice. To tell the story of this history in the making, I developed a method I came to call triage, a decidedly non-innocent form of care. Triage is a word that many familiar with the US will identify with waiting to be seen in the emergency room of a hospital. It is the process by which those waiting for treatment of more or less serious conditions are called up to be seen by doctors and nurses, and it is greatly affected by the large numbers of the uninsured who are only able to receive medical care through emergency rooms, many of whose conditions are acute because of undertreatment and structural inequality. Historically, and in most dictionaries, triage is defined as prioritizing the sick and the wounded. I'm not sure. Slide, thank you. Usually in terms of some combination of urgency and treatability of the injury, feasibility and safety of transport where required, and the value of the life to be saved. Where there are insufficient resources for all to be treated immediately, and fully. In most countries, triage has been codified during times of war and other medical emergencies. During my research, triage, especially with the US connotations of the medically underserved and its resonance with armed conflict, came to see a less and less metaphorical, more and more empirical description of the processes by which some issues and lives came to be cared about as stem cell research was normalized, and by which others were left in the waiting room to receive care later, or on the battlefield to be counted among the dead, forming the necropolitical side of the biopolitics of stem cell research. Lucy Suchman has shown that care and care-like attention are not only critical in biopolitical, but also necropolitical settings, in the mode and means of destruction, as well as reproduction and production, and that not only the life sciences, but the physical sciences and engineering need an ontology and epistemology of care, reminding us that care must not give us a false sense of security. Triage also increasingly described my own process of selectively acquiring data and building my archive. In an environment of an excess of data, documents, field sites, actors, and many drafts of the former, all resonating in a debate that was political and that had local, state, national, and international topographies at stake in intersecting ways, I prioritized some actors, sites, and transcripts over others. This methodological triage concerned my three major foci for data collection and structured my archive. Actors, human and non-human, including their often multiple institutional locations, sites in the story, more and less localized and situated, and the various transcripts, some historically significant and some not at all so, some already directing practice and others under preparation, that echoed through and structured the field site across time and space. So I'm going to just say a little bit about the human triage process, human actor triage process here, because it's very relevant to the case study I'm about to turn to. So I'm going to, during many years, work in and around stem cell policy making, then thinking, teaching, and event hosting, a number of composite figures emerged as research companions, critically informing the writing of the book that resulted and the carrying out of the research in the process. I should say that I serve on 2 stem cell ethics committees and was the LC person for our stem cell center at Berkeley for several years, and consulted with the so some of this stuff is sort of non-optional in an odd way. The sketches below, drawn from my field notes, but I also taught all this time, so I'm getting there's a lot of student perspectives too, illustrate these figures that as much as any individual scientist's or ethicist's work, or any institution's role or stance, defined, defended, and critiqued the field as it unfolded from my perspective. These 5 figures, the engaged student who will likely be a conscripted body and soul into personalized medicine in his or her lifetime, women debating how human embryos and eggs do and don't fit into gift and therapeutic and commercial and research trajectories for body tissue, patients showing border-defying impatience, various kinds of scientists giving voice to the urgency and thrill of the work of the science and innovation involved, and those living with and thinking about non-normative kinds of embodiment, who question what cures will mean and who gets to decide. These were the triaged actors of my work. Tiny word on method, these are as close to verbatim as I could get, taken from different people and stuck together. So figure 1A, a student who was conceived with the help of a sperm donor discusses with me the seemingly inexorable movement aided greatly by social network technologies to find one's biological parents and half-siblings, and the associated trend toward known donors. Do children who are adopted as embryos join these networks, she asks. If there was a reunion for donor children, would the snowflakes come? The snowflakes are the babies made from adopted embryos, mostly by people who are anti-abortion. So often with very different politics. And would they get on with all the queer families using donor gametes and surrogates, asked another student. On another occasion, 2 students raised issues about privacy, anonymity, and reciprocity. If gamete donors should be known, should embryo and stem cell and tissue donors be known too? If donors are known, do they have any financial responsibilities, such as paying for children? On yet another occasion, we discuss who gets intellectual property from known donor cells. Do donors have any chance of getting rich if their cells lead to big scientific breakthroughs? I'm asked what I think about the egg trafficking rings that have been in the news recently. An undergraduate links the economy to putting one's body to research work. I can see why people want to be in clinical trials or to donate eggs or cells or whatever. You can get some money in a bad economy. It's work. For women, you can take care of your children while you do it. You might even get health care while you're doing it. Or you might get to emigrate to a richer country if the scientists or rich patients want you, another student elaborates. On the question of the pros and cons of putting new biological capabilities in the hands of consumers, so-called direct-to-consumer, i.e. mediating access to biomedical tests through a retail outlet rather than a physician or other expert, a student suggests that if Walmart would make cheap stem cell kits, we could patent everything unique about our own stem cells, and then companies would have to buy them from us. Just imagine my cell line could make you immune to the next flu epidemic, and I could get a fat check for my 21st birthday. Figure 2. So this is the women donating human embryos. A young woman talks about donating her eggs for stem cell research versus in vitro fertilization. She prefers to donate for IVF, as she believes she will be better treated, will be paid more, and will have done a genuinely generous thing. Another young woman who hasn't yet had kids said that if she did donate her eggs for an infertile gay or straight couple or individual of whatever race or class or country, she was careful to specify, she wouldn't mind which, you never know who's going to make a good parent. She might ask the doctors to freeze some eggs for her in case she needed them later, and donate half of them only to the couple. Can you do that? She asked. Should the need ever arise for her to seek IVF to get pregnant herself, she says she would donate any leftover embryos from her own treatment to research, though. She doesn't donate to research because she wouldn't want someone else to have her child if she didn't get pregnant herself. She also wouldn't want there to be half-siblings to her own children from the same batch of eggs, the same age, and not known to each other. What if they met in high school and fell in love? Or what if I only had one child and he or she desperately wanted a sibling and the sibling existed but we didn't know about it? Or we did know about it but we couldn't contact them? An older woman who went through IVF told me that ovarian stimulation would be a lot to go through for research alone. It would be weird to get research materials right out of my body in a risky procedure, and I wouldn't feel as good because it wouldn't be helping anyone at the emotional level, suggests a woman who had previously been modestly paid for being a surrogate in the past. There isn't really any connection between donating eggs and research, but helping someone get pregnant makes sense. It's what the body's doing anyway, suggests another. While a young woman sees the money from donating eggs to research as a straightforward way to earn some money to finish her education, take care of her young child without the added emotional difficulties of having been an egg donor or surrogate for a pregnancy and a future living child. A middle-aged woman wishes she had the chance to donate eggs to research while she still could. The science is very exciting. Another middle-aged woman sees egg donation for research as clearly part of a much larger trend to commodify the bodies of women and traffic in women, especially women from the global south and low-income and minority women in the US, and believes the practice should be banned and criminalized. In any case, she thinks that stem cell research is a bad use of funds from a public health perspective, and she doesn't see why the public should foot the bill for research that is not likely to benefit those without medical insurance. A third figure. An old man writes to me and others, he wrote to a group of us, that he will do anything that medicine makes possible to stay alive, despite his stage 4 cancer, despite being a devout Catholic. He worries about the burden of caring for him on his family, but not too much, he reassures us. You have to fight when your life's at stake, he says. He is grateful to live in a country, so he was writing from a European country, with generous nationalized health care. He is disdainful of the lack of universal health care in the US, despite its relative wealth. But he is more angry about the US's stance toward Palestine, which he thinks is holding up the progress of history. It's all connected: peace in the Middle East, our dependence on oil, wasting our money on wars instead of cures. A young woman says she'd go to China for a stem cell treatment if she could, if she needed it. She doesn't see why everyone is demonizing countries that are actually offering treatment, even if it is experimental still. In the US, people will die waiting for the FDA. Figure 4. Scientists talking about it. A middle-aged computer scientist is invigorated by the coming confluence of neuroscience, regenerative medicine, bioinformatics, and bioengineering. The idea of being enhanced and of living longer seems self-evidently the greatest challenge and source of wonderment for the 21st century. A scientist provokes his audience by claiming that global health disparities would not necessarily be exacerbated by increasing longevity, and that the population pyramid, while changing shape because of the increase of older people, would not necessarily be a problem. Old people would no longer be old, he told me. That's the point. Another scientist tells me there is no reason not to develop these technologies in a radical open source manner. He is a libertarian to that extent, he says. Knowledge wants to be free, but freedom also means research autonomy, and stem cell critics don't understand the science and are holding up research. A student engineer thinks that right now we'll keep a lid on life expectancy at the expense of the poorest countries. She is not sure if we're tying up our inventions with intellectual property and trade secrets, keeping cures and technical infrastructure out of the hands of the poor, or if technology transfer only occurs if you have a strong international intellectual property regime. Different concerns of more established and less established scientists. Intergenerational. Figure 5. A woman expresses her commitment to the social model of disability rather than the medical model, describing her body as disabled relative to a norm and within an environment designed around so-called able-bodied people, rather than a body without ability. A student talks about her interactions with medicine. She wants to be able to go to good doctors and get help for the specific ailments from which she suffers. Disability rights and wanting good doctors are not incompatible. She also wants to define for herself, perhaps changing her views over time in conversation with others whose views she respects, and in the light of what is technically possible, how she feels about curing her condition, whatever that might mean. She doesn't think able-bodied or healthy people should decide what needs curing. Nothing about us without us, she reminds me. The stem cell proposition in California was called Research and Cures. So that was the kind of package that was promised. It troubles another student that some prominent stem cell advocates are not the people with the disease, such as the one she has, or condition in question, but a parent of a child or young adult with a condition who could probably speak for him or herself. It is almost as if the parent could not accept their children less than perfect, says another. Though he sees that parents suffer too themselves because there aren't enough resources, and also with fear for their children. The first student points out that disability doesn't mean a suffering life. People should get over that. It's a life with joy and suffering like any other. An academic is deeply suspicious of prenatal and postnatal selective technologies and enhancement, and does not understand why so few people realize that eugenics never went away. There is some humor in the fact that soon no one will be good enough. We're all in need of enhancement now, she chuckles. Okay, so the first thing to say about those, I'm not going to say very much at all, is just that there's an enormous amount going on just in any one of us happens to bump into around us. And so it's never all going to be captured in policy documents. So there's something fairly violent, perhaps good, perhaps not, going on in what ends up having its print moved into policy. Okay, triage, care, donation, and reciprocity. Triage, this stratified necropolitical concept of care, served to remind me that lives were at stake and that I was paying attention to some things and not others. But it also helped me to see other lives that might have mattered more if the triage in the field itself had been different. That other lives might yet come to matter and be cared about and cared for if this affective mode of attention could be brought to bear. One of the topics that concerned me most, and most consistently, was the way that research participants who were neither patients nor scientists nor investors in stem cell research were positioned as contributors to the research. How were their roles delineated and by whom? In particular, I cared about what they might be giving or giving up, if anything, and that what they might be getting, if anything, from the research. Ought what might be given and what might be received to match in some way? And if so, how? And who should decide? This inquiry had urgency because the novelty of Proposition 71 in California, which passed and required $3 billion of state taxes to be given out over 10 years to both public and private stem cell research institutions and facilities. So the money was directly being given across, and so it was a pressing concern, at least from my perspective. There were three groups in my triage sample of research participants that I was concerned about. First, from the nature of the proposition itself, members of the public who paid for and voted for the funds. Should they receive anything in return, such as fiscal trickle-down, relief of burdens on the healthcare system, or access to any therapies developed over time from the research? Second, non-human animals who were positioned in pluripotent stem cell research both epistemologically. When I began fieldwork, characterization of pluripotency required demonstration in an animal model. For example, you couldn't say you had got a line until it behaved a particular way in an animal model. And ethically, with pluripotent stem cells or their products being considered much too risky to be tested on humans. The animals were giving their lives to the true and the good, even though pluripotent stem cell research in genetics and regenerative medicine held out the promise of each of us being our own medicine chest, our own being able to get lines from each of our own bodies. Was there a way to pursue the true and the good in this field that might deconscript some or all of these animals, a way through research not dependent on the substitutive research subject? So those two things are both subjects of other chapters in this book. And finally, there were what we had begun at the time increasingly to refer to as research donors, people donating for research to the field, individuals who are giving their embryos, eggs, cells, and genetic information to stem cell research. Should research donors receive anything from these material gifts? Money? Information about their health status? Healthcare? Tissue storage? Or anything else? So for the rest of the paper, then I'm going to be focusing on this last group, the so-called research donors. For today, I shall limit my comments mainly to the donation of eggs from adult women for research and the donation of somatic tissue from adult men and women for research. I shall not say more here about the donation of embryos or the use of tissue, eggs or others from abortuses, or the common use of fibroblasts from baby boys' foreskin after circumcision, than that they are extremely important sources of cells for stem cell research. Because they all involve questions about which different members of the society in question in which I'm working disagree profoundly, about who the subject of informed consent to the research is. Is it the embryo, is it the fetus, is it the baby, or is it some proxy for one of those, or need it be no one at all? I shall for now put those classes aside, although I do deal with it in other parts of the book. British anthropologist Marilyn Strathern, extraordinary scholar of the gift and of biomedical reproduction and donation, has characterized some of my recent work and that of 2 or 3 other scholars currently working in the US on the circulation of human tissue in biomedicine as containing, and she puts this in inverted commas, an exhortation to reattach reciprocity to the gift, with an exclamation mark. She contrasts this with the effort by one of her French anthropological colleagues to detach, despite a Maussian tradition that finds reciprocity always already implied in the gift, reciprocity from the gift in the case of a gift given by some Melanesian mothers, which is not reciprocated in any way, at least not directly to her. And my apologies for being uncertain on the details of this. It's not at all my area of expertise. Strathern ends by suggesting in typical fashion that, in fact, that these aren't, the point is not that these are contradictory, the point is that they're signs of new growth and work on the gift. But anyway, it's true that in a number of publications in recent years I have made the case for more reciprocity in stem cell research donation in contexts where the dominant voices, often for different reasons, were calling for and cracking down on a situation that entitled the research donor to little or no reciprocity. So this is different. Where eggs were concerned, and to no real recognition as a donor at all, where somatic cells, or fetal embryonic or infant cells for that matter, for stem cell research were concerned. eggs and somatic cells have several different antecedents that might have been drawn on in deciding how to proceed. It's important to find out what these are, why and how and by whom the two kinds of cells have been funneled away from reciprocity, and why, how, and by whom the gift of somatic cells has been moved to try to reduce it conferring research subjecthood at all. From there, one can begin to ask what would serve the triaged voices, the ones I'm carrying in my head, and others too, in terms of research subjecthood, participation, donation, and reciprocity. This was my inquiry. I prefer to think of it as an exhortation to reattach care to the gift. If one were to begin afresh thinking about human tissue circulating in regenerative medicine, attentive to the skein of the triage voices above, thinking that they all have significance, what might the inquiry look like? In the United States, the process of institutionalizing human pluripotent stem cell research brought a lot of attention to the question of whether at all, and if so, under what conditions, embryos could be procured for research. The procurement of women's eggs, while receiving less attention than many feminists thought appropriate, also received considerable attention. Attention fell off precipitously, however, with the establishment of efficient ways of creating pluripotent stem cell lines from somatic, i.e. non-germline cells, so-called induced pluripotent stem cell lines. Stem cell research funding bodies moved to reduce the regulatory burden of reviewing the procurement of somatic cells on the grounds that A, procuring human somatic cells is not especially controversial, B, the procurement of somatic tissue for research was already routine before stem cell research, and C, ethics committees for stem cell research are not necessary, especially for in vitro induced pluripotent stem cell research, because the common rule covering human subjects' participation in federally funded research already covered the necessary ethical aspects of it. In fact, though, a number of recent developments have shown that the provenance, procurement, and disposition of somatic cells is becoming more and more controversial in the United States, and in fact in many countries, and that established practices were not in any case the result of effective public consultation. Stem cell research could have been the moment at which the entire paradigm of giving up our bodily tissues and cells came under sustained public scrutiny, but it did not turn out this way. I'm still trying, but basically whenever I really, really believe something, it becomes the least popular view and it gets no policy attention. But anyway, in the US, public attention to the circulation of human tissue for stem cell research rose and fell with the abortion debate, and human biomedical tissue circulation fell back into the private sector, which includes, at the moment in the US, the public R&D arm of federally funded research universities. Sorry, I didn't put that quite right, but that complex, that innovation complex, we could call it. So the field of assisted reproductive technologies has, I'm on to eggs now, we missed. No, we'll pass it. Thank you. The field of assisted reproductive technologies has staged a sustained conversation over the last 2 decades about whether and how much to compensate surrogacy and gamete, especially egg donation. So, a reputable Beverly Hills egg donor brokerage. This is my most didactic, my favorite didactic how to be an egg donor for IVF site. So it's a pretty reputable Beverly Hills egg donor brokerage. Explains what is to be expected during egg donation. The agency's role is to connect outstanding young women who are willing and able to give this life-changing gift to recipients looking to build a family. Connection is one very important building block in reciprocity, very often, in many kinds of reciprocity. That's going to be done by the brokerage. The recipient of the eggs, or her surrogate, if there's going to be an egg donor and a surrogate to help a woman get pregnant, will receive eggs from someone she has chosen from a psychologically and medically screened database of available donors whose pictures and information the recipients see. And I and many others have written about how that process goes and what things people pay attention to and so on. In this site, this site has very modest, it pays $6,500 for a normal egg donor. You get an extra $500 if you're an academic achiever, having an advanced degree. Or so, I mean, often it's way worse than that. And this is within the American Society for Reproductive Medicine guidelines of ceilings on this. And you also get more if you're a repeat donor, and you get more if you're good, if you're compliant and you respond well. You get lots of eggs from your ovaries. But anyway. But I picked this one because it's the most didactic of all the sites, and it also does keep all its practices within, under the ceiling proposed by the American Society for Reproductive Medicine of what's an appropriate amount to pay an egg donor. If both donor and recipient agree, they can talk on the phone anonymously or meet, but they do not have to. Now, this is a quote. The recipients assume all moral, legal, and financial responsibility for any children born from the egg donation. Egg donors have absolutely no parental rights or responsibility for the future welfare or support of these children. So some very important disconnection/alienation is going on there. The recipient pays all costs, including the donor's attorney fees, for making the contract. The recipient gets a baby with ongoing obligations to that child. The future rights of the child to contact the donor are unspecified. These are, in here in Canada in particular, really, really up for grabs, but they are everywhere at the moment. Recipients are due care and consideration. So the word care comes up, but it comes up in how everybody ought to treat the woman who's going to get the donated eggs. And the explanation for why she's due care and consideration is because of the time and expense related to infertility, not to mention, thereby mentioning, the tremendous emotional toll that it takes means that a higher level of compassion is required. The donor also receives something when she makes her life-changing gift, though it is not an exchange for the gift itself, and every party is very clear on that, and that's what everyone has to practice a lot. For her time, energy, and commitment, she is compensated twice, these are quotes. Once with a financial payment, and once with the sense of fulfillment she receives from helping to complete her family, another exclamation mark. In case there is any doubt, these two kinds of reciprocity for her egg donation go hand in hand, with the money being given in the context of the already present correct affective orientation to the gift. In addition to the personal satisfaction, this is in another place it says it again in a different way, you will have, knowing that you helped create a family. So that one's put first this time because it has to be your background feeling. And I've worked in enough of these clinics to know it has to be. You won't be chosen. You will be bloody miserable. Like it or not, it is a condition of the procedure. You will receive compensation for your inconvenience and time, and all of your expenses are paid by the recipients. Recipients are equally reassured. I make so many of those slips that we used to say were Freudian. That donors will have been screened regarding their motivation for becoming an egg donor. So this affective orientation is coming up again and again. And are committed to seeing through the gift. The donor should display care, and the word comes up in how the donor should behave, not how people should treat the donor, rather than receive it. In order to know how to behave so as to be chosen, to be successful, and in case it is hard for the donor to walk away from the donation once compensated, there is an Ask an Egg Donor webpage attached to this one brokerage, where prospective donors can have their errant feelings and opinions realigned with the nature of the gift and its allocated reciprocity by a star former donor. Blonde-haired and blue-eyed, the retired donor models through reports of her own experiences the upbeat donor with few side effects, who is completely happy with the glow of the gift, and presumably her never-mentioned monetary compensation, discloses her donation to the right people, and feels no need for further contact with the recipient or any resulting children about whom she has no doubt that they belong to the recipients. Future children's rights to contact her and complicate the picture of a one-off single moment of gift and reciprocity, as I said before, are not mentioned. All the gift reciprocity scripts for recipient, donor, and even to some extent the broker and other professionals involved in the transaction are rehearsed there on the web and throughout the process so that each player can learn how to behave and thus how to give and receive appropriately relative to their own role. In contemporary California and many other parts of the US, scripts, albeit contested and changeable over time, and much as one might wish them changed in all kinds of ways, for the various currently permissible gift reciprocity pairs for egg donation in assisted reproductive technologies, have emerged over time to a point where they have a certain degree of stability. The agency takes care of connection, and the recipient provides the means by which a gift is compensated, and takes over long-term care of the outcome of the gift, the child, if there is one. The donor herself is independently motivated to give the gift of life and is satisfied when she has done so. If she has not, it is because something has gone wrong. This combination of parts played by each party allows the gift of an egg to be reciprocated in a way that is a direct, she's compensated at the time of donation, one-off, although the gift keeps giving in the life of the child, someone else takes care of that part of it, exchange of unlike for unlike, money for the woman who caringly gave her eggs. This is not the same as buying eggs, the usual model in capitalist societies of exchanging a valuable for a fungible currency that is one-off, unlike for unlike, and entails no further obligation, regardless of one's emotions. So it's like, but it isn't capitalism. So you have to do the right. You have to get there. There are many problems with the way that egg donation in ARTs in the US is organized, but the fact that the gift reciprocity relation has been required to receive attention means that ways of articulating the gift and compensation for it have not been completely unilateral. They don't only have one person's voice in it, and just for 1 second bracketing aside all the problems. The advent of human embryonic stem cell research using women's eggs was accompanied by regulation and you know how on those new Facebook things you can put that little picture at the back of you put your little face and you have a picture at the back on the timeline? This is completely the soundtrack I'd choose for my playtime. I'd choose for my background on Facebook. It's really lovely. The advent of human embryonic stem cell research using women's eggs was accompanied by regulation and rhetoric aimed at shoring up the altruism of donors to research through the banning of payment to donors. Progressives and women's groups wanted to protect women from the medical risks involved, and thus they wanted to disincentivize donation. The framers of Proposition 71 did not want to commercialize egg donation or in any way appear to be buying and selling body parts, let alone potential reproductive tissue, which is all the bad things that people could then associate with this proposition, which was just about research and cures. In practice, this meant that in California, would-be egg donors for stem cell research were expected to undergo risk without gain. For egg donors undergoing a risky and invasive procedure, this contrast with those eugenically favored who were paid large sums to donate to assisted reproductive technologies for doing exactly the same thing was very striking. Okay, so moving now to iPS cells, somatic cells. Now, our Stem Cell Research Oversight Committee at Berkeley was requested to comment for a meeting this month in April 2012 on the California Institute for Regenerative Medicine's March 2012 draft induced pluripotency stem cell research, draft consent for ongoing donor interaction. And so basically this was a model consent for getting somatic tissue from donors for stem cell research. And the point was to move it out of all the regulatory apparatus that have been evolving over the last 4, 5, 6 years around gametes and embryos. To move it back into human subjects committees and out of the eye of the public. Out of the eye of regulation and out of the eye of the public. This model consent form template, in many ways a cutting-edge text that is the product of the work of many bioethicists and clinicians, is not meant to be the last word in donation ethics. The guy told us that. It's meant to reduce bureaucratic redundancy and to be in line with principles compatible with state, California law, and CERM regulations, and to resonate with national regulations covering federally funded research and the National Academies of Science 2008 stem cell research guidelines, for example, and even international policies such as the International Society for Stem Cell Research model consent forms, for example. Nonetheless, several problems it has inherited haunt it in ways that make it, I would argue, inadequate to say that it is merely doing bureaucratic work. Consider these quotes from the model consent. So we were supposed to comment on this. Research is not designed to provide direct medical benefit to you and will not be restricted to a specific disease or condition. In other words, don't expect anything for you or for anyone with your condition from this donation. You will not be paid for participation in this study. You are eligible for reimbursement for any direct expense incurred as a result in participation. No compensation. If any medical products result from your participation, you will not be entitled to any of the profits associated with such products. But others on the value chain, maybe, probably will be. Where egg donors for IVF need to want to give the gift of life, tissue donation, for a while, has valorized altruism as the ideal motivation for participating in biomedical research. And oddly, that's one of the things that was passed on to egg donation for research, this valorization of altruism, not out of ARTs, but coming out of tissue donation. coming out of the medical context. The donor does it for the good of science and possible future good of others and does not expect any immediate gain. This is not exactly the same as saying that there's no expectation of reciprocity. Studies have found that patients donating tissue believe that they, their family members, or others with their condition might be helped one day by their donation. In Britain, they have this wonderful concept of solidarity that gives you non-individualistic collective terms to account for these communities, almost self-evident collective communities of care. The US doesn't have such a concept that's active in the field, at least as far as I can discover from working in it, but I think it's nonetheless a useful concept. In the stem cell research case, however, one is not to expect to be helped by the donation, and the research, because of the immortalized nature of the stem cell lines, cannot be directed, making not only withdrawal from research, but also the idea that it will help people like me untenable except in the broadest sense. You just can't know what your cells are going to be used for. Once your cells are out there, there's no stopping them being used for who knows what research. So the window to withdraw is very tiny, and you're not going to know what's going to happen to them. Perhaps more importantly, though, somatic tissue circulation in the US is currently trying, at least where I'm working, is currently trying hard to hold on to two hard-won policy and legal pathways, of which the effort to reduce regulation in the use of iPS cells in CERN-funded research is a product. First, it's inherited a long line of legal moves to make sure that human beings from whom tissue is derived have no property interests in any commercially viable cell lines or any biomedical products. Think about the furor that has been recently around the HeLa cells, think of more versus UC Regents, and so on. The contesting of the heel pricks and taking tissue from newborns, the supine case, many things in this area. And second, a flourishing commerce in human biologics, many of which do not currently require informed consent at all because they don't recognize a donor, they don't recognize a research participant, and whose industries, especially those selling abortus-derived cells, would rather that they were not newly a subject of inquiry. And in some cases, they're also worried about the abortion debate, and would rather the laws that regulate them currently were not disturbed. So given that the fetal tissue research is legal, for example, and that it's all very undercover, you don't say that you're doing it online, you have to really be in the know to know how to find those companies. It's not like finding an egg donor online, which is the opposite. So where I'm working, there seems to be a tremendous investment in keeping these two things as the status quo and not rocking the boat on these issues. What these two things mean is that commercial interests and innovation already have their interests internalized in the current arrangements, but others do not. So there's a care deficit insofar as these people who are supposed to be being altruistic are supposed to be being, as Radhika Rao puts it, unilaterally altruistic. Furthermore, the current situation, because it alienates the tissue from the donors, should at least protect donor privacy. This, however, is no longer guaranteed, as the consent form acknowledges. So it's actually really important what's going on in the science right now. It's really important to take that into account. As the form says lower down, in the future, we may want to contact you to obtain additional information regarding past or current health conditions. The information may be important for research, developing medical products, or treating disease. If you consent to be recontacted, you have the right to withdraw this consent at any time. If you decide to withdraw, this is another quote from another part, if you decide to withdraw after your sample has been used to generate iPSCs, then your materials will be made anonymous by removing the codes that provide the link between the cells and your identity. We will then retain the research materials, such as any remaining skin, blood, or hair sample, and any remaining iPSC lines, and associated medical information, and we will continue distribution. Since iPSCs made from your cells contain your genetic information, there's a very small risk that they could potentially be linked to you in the future, even though we will have removed all the links between the cells and your identity. This iPSC consent form both does and does not recognize that consent cannot in fact be revoked. Once cell lines go into circulation, their ability to reproduce in an immortalized state means that there's no way to control the diffusion and no way to take back the consent for their donation and use once the donation has resulted in the circulated cell line. Therefore, there's no way to revoke consent. Participation must be ongoing even if risks emerge or the direction of the research becomes repugnant to donors. The model consent also only imagines recontact from the researcher's point of view. A two-way system would need to be sensitive in changes in the research and biomedical fields, triggering reconsent as protocols change, while maximally protecting donor privacy. There are going to be enormous challenges to protect donor privacy, which would only partly be met by existing anti-discrimination legislation in health insurance and employment and current data encryption methods. There would also be substantial bureaucratic hurdles associated with recontact and maintaining contact with donors. As we know from the fates of abandoned embryos, so-called abandoned embryos, cryopreserved around the world, recontact while protecting privacy can be fiendishly difficult. Similarly, there may be some people who would prefer not to be contacted and some kinds of information that some people might prefer not to know, just as we're finding in fledgling genomics studies. And no one has even begun to think in a principled way about under which conditions biomedically obtained information could be used by law enforcement and passed over into forensic databases. How might one proceed? To begin to care, so just to wrap up now, much must change. Informed consent would need to be more dynamic and ongoing. Donors and researchers would need to be able to stake and reshape interests in the light of treatment success, scientific discovery, or business potential, and in response to concerns about safety or direction of research or access. Care poses considerable bureaucratic hurdles. The current one-sided, relatively irrevocable consent procedure would need to become at least two-sided and ongoing, with researchers and other interested parties also needing to sign informed consent forms, and with information-triggered points of recontact. Adjudication of competing interests always takes time to broker, and usually conflict is not resolved so much as rendered workable. It is always there ready to resurface when the political moment requires it. I would like to see a systematic exchange of information, and where appropriate, a right to the storage of biological tissue and materials, such as the cell lines derived from those tissues, for donors' future therapeutic use, as well as for researchers' use. That's something I think would be great. I like this solution because it matches the nature of the connection to the fruits of the research itself. The best research you have, the more you have to give me by storing my tissue. It also offers an incentive to donate that is not purely monetary, thereby making room to critique the commercialization of donation in some cases, and without sounding the death knell for scientific research. The minute you go just to altruism, then everybody starts to cry out about scarcity. Although you don't have to plan it. Of particular importance would be how to make donation and its subsequent potential therapeutic benefits as broadly available as possible, especially to the most vulnerable members of society. Drawing on Anne-Marie Moll's distinction between logics of choice and care, one could say that the donation moment is currently packaged as choice, ethicized as autonomy, and operationalized as informed consent. In the current donation paradigm, a patient's interactions in circulating her body tissue are limited to the moment of consent and alienation. This relinquishes the hope of doing something about the ongoing and emerging ethical layers interlinking donors and regenerative medicine. A logic of care, on the other hand, enjoins us to follow the ongoing relations between the tissue and the bodies from which they were procured, as well as all the other actors. Moll, like Burfoot, cautions against an opposition between cure and care, and for my purposes here, where a rapprochement between these is essential, this caution couldn't be more apropos. The aim should be to, as Anne-Marie Moll, Ingun Moser, and Jeanette Bowles express it, strengthen care practices. In conclusion, how our societies navigate the age of pluripotency and biogenetic triage is, to my mind, of the utmost urgency. There will be new kinds of political and ethical attention required of a pluripotent screening society. Developments in genomic biobanking stand as a cautionary tale for all kinds of biobanking. The risk is a populace divided into those who are subject to criminal biosurveillance and those for whom genomics is a blueprint for personalized medicine, where neither group has significant interactions with the provenance, procurement, or disposition, including appropriate reciprocities, of human tissue. Thank you for your attention.
Is going to offer a response.
So, thank you. And I will start by thanking you again for being here. Like many of you, I have been a great fan of Charis Thompson's work for a long time and have always been impressed by her rendering of what it means to care about the world and our role as researchers and academics, and not only our role but also our responsibility for this. In my own work and in my own caring, I am frequently reminded of her assessment that, and I'm citing, I care greatly about patients and also about non-humans and quasi-humans, but I care more about people, cyborg they may be. I agree and find it a good example of the pragmatics of care. Now, I have a habit of requiring that my graduate students read parts of Charis's book, Making Parents, where she challenges established feminist views of objectification as disempowerment. And today, Charis is asking us to go through a similar exercise of critical thinking and non-innocent thinking and engagement. She asks us to similarly challenge and question the politics of research and long-held views of how to regulate and connect to our bodies and its parts. She asks us to move from a politics of donation to a politics of care, and more to the point, and this was more salient in the previous paper, from a politics of altruism, anonymity, and alienation to one of care, connection, contact, and reciprocity. Part of her claim is that these new politics are attentive not only to policy, that is to the regulatory framework of biomedical donation, but also to the ethical framework that guides those decisions, and in fact, the donations themselves. And so, in 5 minutes or so, I will think aloud about these new politics or these new logics of care, and I'll do so in 2 ways. I'll try to think about what this might mean for other kinds of linkages that we have to ourselves, so outside of stem cell research, and I'll then think a bit about what is lost and gained in moving forward to an ethical framework. Now, care, as Charis Thompson has shown, is both a means to do research, a method, and a way of knowing, an epistemology. Care makes things significant. And here I find myself thinking of Isabel Stenger's assessment of models and metaphors as lures that scientists use to make us care. In other words, to what extent might care itself be a lure? And if care itself is a lure, then how do we prevent it from becoming naturalized? Because as Charis points out, care is not without its problems, and one has only to think about Michel Foucault's work on the care of the self to recall a discourse of self-control and obligation. The move from altruism to a logic of care, as Charis points out, and care and Charis are very similar words, involves not losing track of ourselves and our body parts. It involves relationships. It involves dialogue rather than knowledge transfer, which those of you who write grants would know. And it also involves, as Charis proposes, a systematic information exchange, often done through chains of informed consent. But I ask, what might a framework of care mean for other kinds of linkages that we have to ourselves? And I'll give you an anecdotal example. A few months ago, I bought a small black box that I wear on my forehead that I then connect to my phone and that quantifies my sleep. It is truly a small black box with its analogies to those of a plane. And according to its makers, it monitors brain. No, it doesn't work. It moves. So those are not real numbers. I hope. In the morning, when you wake up, it gives you this. It gives you a ZQ number, a figure that you can relate to, and that will tell you the quality of your sleep. And those red bars, that's when my son wakes up. Now, underlying this argument is the figure of a deficient body that is alienated from itself and from others. Technology works to naturally reconnect the acting and knowing body. Technology and information technology is then the means of care, but it is also the obligation to care. As the makers of my black box point out, if you can measure it, you can improve it. This is obviously not what care is pointing us toward. On the contrary, but it is perhaps something to think about. How can we prevent caring from becoming a re-articulation of contemporary logics of information as the superior, neutral, authentic, disembodied good? And I am reminded here of President Obama's current efforts to create a big science, big data, public-funded project. Importantly, I'm also interested in asking how can we intervene to ensure that it does not become part of the discourse of self-control. Now, these are important questions because, as one of Charis's informants points out, the essence of our times is that we are all deficient, or as he puts it, I think it's a he, it could be a she, perhaps it's my prejudice, we are all in need of enhancement now. Now, part of the answer to my questions is given by Charis when she says that we must recapture why people care and how they care. But I think it would also be interesting, as we discuss, to think and hear more about this, about connections other than donations, about those acts and modes of caring that remain within our bodies. Which brings me to my next point, that of ethics as a framework. I, like Charis, have unexpectedly started caring about regulation and policy in my research on nanotechnology. Following the actors involves following those many humans. In my case, it has involved being branded as an ethicist doing ELSI kind of work, so ethics, legal, societal implications work. And for me, this has involved a conflict because ethics are too often equated with values, and those values are then placed in contemporary scientific discourse as the opposite of facts, and so they come to stand outside of science. Charis and others, namely Lorraine Code, who is here today, have pointed out this need not be so. But I wonder with Sheila Jasanoff if ethics, with its well-established meaning in history, with its long-standing relationship to bioethics, does not reinforce what we are opposing here. That is the privatization of these connections, of these goods into values that are then better assessed through the hands of experts in IRB boards. In other words, is ethics the framework we are aiming for, or do we need other imaginings, interventions, and renamings? And to summarize, can this ethical institutional framework be choreographed so as to achieve a result that subverts the current logics of privatization, specialization, and extra scientific affect? As Charis has done in her previous work, she points us here to paths forward while keeping track of moments of breakdown. And I'm really thrilled to hear this, and I'm really thrilled to learn more about how to engage in a different ethical choreography. And those are really the last words on my paper, and that's the title of your book, so I'm very happy.
I'll be happy to know I'm the last formal speaker before we open up and get some more voices. It's nice that we have these. Thanks so much, Charis, for that sneak preview into your book, or those two, the one that was sent me, and then it won't be a problem at all. And it's apt articulation with our workshop theme. To structure my comments, I want to begin with an everyday speech act, not about caring, but about not caring. I want to ask, what does it mean to say, I don't care? And we're pulling together a whole bunch of things. I'm thinking of Maria's attention to neglected things, and then I'm thinking of neglected generations, and I'm thinking of this one. When I'm reminded of variations of this statement, I don't care, that you might be more likely to hear on a playground than in a university. See if I care. I don't give a care. And a personal favorite that must be obsolete now and is probably like marking me in a particular moment as growing up in the 80s. Here's a quarter. Call someone who cares. So these statements ostensibly meant by the 6-year-old speaker to convey neutrality to the issue at hand. I'm going to tell your mother, see if I care. It meant to say, I'm not interested, it's not significant to me. they're anything but neutral, of course. They're taunts that are meant instead to catch the child spoken to, the one who does care, in an embarrassing and even vulnerable position. They absolve the speaker of emotional entanglement in the situation, leaving him or her on the higher ground, unfettered, stronger, cooler. So whether or not the kid means it, and he usually doesn't, I think, the performance of not caring seems to confer a privilege in many domains on and beyond the playground. On the epistemological playground, as Lorraine Coe shows us without that metaphor, to be caught caring is often tantamount to being disqualified from the game of legitimate, objective, value-free knowledge. In some strains of science studies, too, injunctions to not care about what is true of the world, a requirement of methodological symmetry, hold sway. I think not particularly in this crowd we're hearing, we're talking about the domains we're in this weekend, but nonetheless in some journals, some schools, some places, that to not be caught caring is an important part of training to be an STS scholar, and I want to sort of pull that into the conversation. The paradox here, of course, is that none of us in science or science studies would be moved to do the work that we do without caring. Feminists read this not as a paradox inhibiting adequate knowledge, but an inevitable condition of being situated in the worlds we study, interacting with our research subjects and objects, of being human and animal. What does it mean for scholars to be caught caring? What privileges in our sites of study accrue to those who say, I don't give a care? So Charis has once again given us a robust case to think with. And I love how you capture complexity in both in the previous book and in the talk we heard today. And eschew easy answers. So I want to locate these questions. My questions are, what does it mean to be caught caring? And what privileges accrue to those who say I don't give a care? I want to locate them in your case a little bit. So one instantiation of caring as an academic is to make so-called normative claims about better ways for the actors we follow to do what they do. In many disciplines, this wouldn't be noteworthy. It's part of the job. But as I mentioned in particular corners of STS, it is uncommon to show your hand, so to speak. So Charis, you describe participating in formal deliberations on stem cell boards, etc., on ethical, bureaucratic comings together that make policy. And I'm curious to hear more about that. You mentioned that it was asked of you, sort of by the world that you're moving in. I encountered, I'm sorry for this, I encountered an article on Berkeley's online magazine, Illuminations, which says, the mild-mannered Thompson may seem an unlikely scholar to find in the middle of such a nasty fray. So I wonder if you could tell us more about this nasty fray. What has been asked of you by your research subjects? How do you simultaneously study this domain and act in it? And has your entanglement in your research site ever resulted in you being caught caring in a way that compromises your expertise? My second question goes with you into the regulatory domain of stem cell ethics and politics to consider the interventions you propose to reconnect, and I think this came across in this version of the talk too, to reconnect donors to their gift in an ongoing kind of relationship of reciprocity, of care. I'm convinced by the testimony of your composite figures that people do care about the dispersal, do already care about the dispersal, maintenance, use, and value of their biological materials or their body bits. How they care, how much, about which bits, is not, of course, pre-given, and I'm not suggesting you would take that to be the case. That's what you're trying to track, right? It is tied up in narratives available to them. Most obviously, perhaps, from the media, but also from those made available by the scholarship that you do in interesting ways. I'm reminded of a very different script for caring about bodily bits and far predating stem cells, that propelled my great-great-aunt Kate, who overlapped with my lifetime briefly, to save her fingernail clippings and hair cuttings, pending their reunification with her body in heaven. What connections make sense, connections to our bodily bits, and which ones what makes sense to any particular actor is deeply contextual, of course. As they say, your garbage is someone else's treasure. In any case, the wonderfully diverse interests of the composite figures the Californians captured in your ethnographic stories suggest that, as Charis says, severance of biological and biographical ties in policy does not sever the affective and potential economic connections people feel to themselves, gametes, genes, and genes in the emerging economies of the life sciences. So those wonderful quotes that you shared with us show that in spite of an informed consent, the purpose of which is to sever that tie is not already being severed. There's a lot of diverse and interesting and sometimes bizarre thinking and caring and feeling that goes on around these questions. Existing informed consent documents require patients and donors, everyday people, to say, I don't give a care, legally if not affectively. What privileges and for whom are sustained by this prevailing ethic of altruistic donation, anonymity, and alienation that you're critical of? The interests protected in this arrangement, the privileges, are most obviously linked to capital. But in mundane scientific research practice, they are more often, I'm guessing, but you can tell us more, about ease or administrative convenience. The severance of those ties becomes a matter of knowledge wants to be free, to quote one of your actors. Ease of storage, transfer, manipulation, and disposal. It's simply easier not to care. I'm going to tell a really quick aside from a student that I and several others here are working with, Jenny Ha, who's doing her dissertation research right now and was invited to be a respondent here. She's doing her research on cord blood banking and has to be in Vancouver because of family caring situation. In any case, one of her findings is that in the current world of cord blood banking, women who are enrolled in the project by glossy brochures and OB-GYNs and companies and friends to say, this is what I need to do, this is the right thing, I can spend that X amount of money to bank my child's cord blood, are then finding that they do all the work to make that happen, including labeling vials, making sure that it's done. There are labor issues in which nurses are caught up and doctors are caught up. They courier their samples from the hospital to the private cord blood, et cetera, et cetera. So all of this work, which is one of the neat findings that Jenny is thinking about, is not immediately obvious when you say, okay, I do that, I'll do that, I care what happens, I care about keeping this material. So to use Ruth Schwartz Cohen's phrase, this ends up being more work for mother. That is all an illustration of my point. It's simply easier not to care. In the prevailing ethic of donation and alienation from biographies and biologies, researchers are privileged to have access to research materials relatively unencumbered or unfettered by the morass of interests embodied by your interviewees. So Charis proposes that policy modifications ought to reconnect the chain of caring or make visible and valid the attachments people already feel to their bodily materials. In the domain of stem cell research practice, I imagine that caring, among many other things, means a whole lot more paperwork. Each cell line would be tethered to its erstwhile host by a chain of bureaucracy, including, I suppose, monthly bank statements and taxes and so on, perhaps. And so I'll end with this question. Is there a contradiction inherent in the enactment of caring through a proliferation of red tape? Are bureaucracies and caring practices oppositional impulses, as they are sometimes supposed to be, and of course it's more complicated than that? What kind of costs should feminists anticipate from strengthening the relations of care in this domain? Are we in for more than that work? Thank you. Rather
So we now have an opportunity to open up for questions and an opportunity for all three of you to respond. I'd like to. Would you like to actually respond maybe to a couple of those points before everything and we will come back?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you, first of all. It was very lovely that you said it to me to think about the care of the self. It's very, very interesting. Also, not to care and how to care in a way that isn't dreadful.
It's just hard to hear you.
Oh, sorry.
Elevation.
Two really quick things on not caring. Everybody cares a lot sometimes. Scientists really care a lot about the science and about being successful. And tenure committees for scientists care about your innovation. So there are lots and lots of things going on for everybody. A lot of times informed consent really is a moment where it doesn't matter whether you care about these things, because you care so much more about the thing you're getting access to. That people, I mean, that's one of the dreadful things about informed consent is you just want the treatment, you just want the procedure, so who cares about all these small things. So it's caring or not is very, very context dependent. And, if you're trying to fix some bit of your body, your cares about the world at large kind of have a really different causal space, and it's very hard to make it come onto this particular form right now. So it's sort of oppositional. Yeah, I mean, the symmetry thing, I talked about my kind of feminist training, but I was raised on the causality, impartiality, symmetry, and reflexivity, and the strong program of Edinburgh, and then the some students probably, that injunction, even in the so-called double symmetry, double axis of symmetry, or the actor network theory, and some feminist technoscience things added to the strong program. That's probably a nice way of putting it, friendly way of putting it. Still had an injunction to I think more in the case of the active network theory. Well, I should leave this to Maria. I mean, her correction of matters of concern into matters of care, I think, says it all. But the impartiality in the strong program, that kind of injunction, not to wear your heart on your sleeve, not to show your card, is, I think, really strong in our field, and we've grappled, I think, all along with what to do with that. Many of us have grappled with what to do with that. And the regulatory burden thing, absolutely. I mean, everything is, and it's really, really true too. I mean, the burden, when somebody wants to do stem cell research on our campus, human subjects, as usual, normal, it's going to do that. Animal care and use. I've no whole huge story about what to say about those aspects attached to those research subjects, but it's got to go through that. But it's got to go through Stem Cell Research Oversight Committee, and we're looking for acceptably derived. Is the main thing we're looking for in terms of the line in question. If it's got some gametes or embryos in it, did they get laundered from being life to being research materials appropriately? And that's all laid out really, really laundered. Sorry, it's a really strong word. It's late for me. It's midnight. But did they get turned into that properly? It's a huge bundle. And there's no question that for many of the scientists on my campus and others that I've talked to have one fewer committees to go through is a very fine thing. And for many of us on the committee too, actually, honestly, to have one fewer committee meeting to go to. So as you say that, but you were also implying, I think, that bureaucracy isn't necessarily opposed to care. And anyway, that's all I'll say for now.
Wonderful. We have two questions. One, Joan?
Well, actually, I was going to encourage you to respond to Erin's question about what it's like being inside the policy-making process rather than observing it from outside as an STS scholar. So I'd like to invite you to comment on that.
Yes, I think many people are in this position to a greater or lesser extent. So sometimes it's been really, really beneficial. Like there was one meeting I was asked to speak at where everybody, because of conflict of interest regulations, had to stand up and announce who their funders were, and then say what they wanted to say about the topic, and then it came to me, and it's like, well, I have a research fund for $1,000. It has to last me a year. The last little bits of an NSF that I began, so there's something about there's something to be concerned with these matters that is not, in a way, to come from these kinds of disciplinary positions and be speaking on these matters that makes you cleaner because your interests are less big, you're less corrupt. And I think time and time again, people have used that language of being less corrupt. But at other times too, when I raise issues in ethics committee, in the stem cell research oversight committee, I'm usually shut down. I would say maybe always, nearly always. I'm nearly always shut down, but I'm shut down first on the surface because it's a grammatical mistake. The question is not, is it okay to treat these cells in that way? The question is it legal and ethical, and did they meet our requirements? We're supposed to see, is this scientist going to put any cell lines into an animal? Are they going to put any into a human? Which country did they get their stem cell lines from? Were the informed consents in place for the people, for the original materials? If it was leftover embryos from an IVF clinic, are the consents all in place, and so on and so forth? We're just supposed to do that. We're supposed to say whether or not they're acceptably derived. So to say, well, it might be acceptably derived, but it doesn't seem very ethical in this case, is grammatically wrong. And if you do it too often, you become not only, so it's a grammatical error in place, so you have to be corrected, but then you also just trouble. And in the US, where there isn't the great and the good, like there is in the UK, for example, where the person who stands for, there isn't really the notion of the person who is impartial at all. The person who stands for the general public is, on the one hand, a theologian, but you can only be a particular kind of theologian. You can only be one for whom it's okay to do human embryonic research. So you can be a Mormon because they don't think that the embryo is alive until it's in your uterus. Go Romney. You can Jewish, many of those roles are played by. You can be some kinds of Protestant, and very definitely not others, not Catholic and not evangelical Protestant by and large. So that position is really circumscribed to who can be that in terms of the member of the public. And the other one is a stem cell advocate. And the stem cell advocates have been in California have been caught up in the complex of innovation in a way where one is almost inclined to say late at night that they've been used. Of course, they're kind of, to use Sarah Franklin's terms, they're kind of fictive desperation. Not fictive, I mean, desperation is, God knows it's real, but all of us all the time, but it's, the packaged desperation has been used to put them as voice people for the research, and then they become pushers and will say things that the scientists themselves won't say, even if the scientists are producing the materials. So yes, good and bad.
Another question from Lucy?
Yeah, thank you all for that. That was great. I wanted to pick up on Erin's nice reminder about fingernails. Because I think it reminds us well, and I guess what I wanted to ask Charis to reflect on a little more is the performativity of discourses of care. I was also struck in your triage method that I felt I'd heard every one of those voices before. So it's a collage of circulating discourses about what imaginaries are available to us through which to articulate our care. And so I'm interested in your feeling about that and about that as a site of intervention. What does it mean for us, those of us who are interested in figuring out a way of engaging with these issues?
Should I answer? I'm not sure that.
Or maybe it doesn't have to be for you. It could be for
it could be for.
But I guess to me, it's about denaturalizing that for many of, or maybe for saying for many of us, I think not caring about our fingernails is a deeply incorporated relation. No, we easily alienate ourselves from those body parts. So that it's those and not others is culturally and historically specific in ways that
Yeah, and there's a couple of lines in here and much, much more elsewhere on just quite how important I find that repertoire of available. It does change over time, but a lot of it is recursive, and I made a little comment about things that conflict can re-arise, and being the didacticism about the scripts, and I'm not sure if I cut it or not, but I had a sentence about being very particular to the time and the place and the political culture within which you're legislating, the jurisdictions within which you're legislating, so the practicalities of what is and isn't legal, but also for the people in question, what does and doesn't matter to them. And I spent a little bit of time looking at just how many bits of the body there are that are given by live or dead donors, and just how many biographies these things have. And even just in the contemporary period, and of course they go back. The historians have done work on this stuff since for thousands of years. On thousands of years worth of history on how the difficulties and eases with which bits of bodies move around and who minds which. So I just to absolutely agree with you on. I'm using words like script and repertoire and things like that, which I'm not sure if they're the right words. Sometimes it seems really clear there are, like on that one website where this is how you would behave if you are a good egg donor, and you rehearse and rehearse and rehearse. But sometimes there's much more at stake. And then there are settings where people will use one, not another, because one thing and not another matters.
And of course, our what's available to us for voicing counter narratives is similarly constituted.
So the triage that I was working on was things that were really, really specific to things that got excluded in the way California packaged it around this innovation complex, which has all sorts of splendid things in it as well. But thank you so much.
Carla has a question.
I'm just wondering if you could say more about the stakes of problematizing the connection between care and altruism, and whether you would think about your definition of care as gesturing towards new kinds of moral economies.
All these questions are so great. Thank you, everybody. So I've gone back and forth about whether, depending on the month, when I was fighting with these topics, the altruism was just such a dirty. I got so sick of it. I was so angry with hearing people say that all these people should be altruistic. But as I've stepped back, and Britain has run this consultation, which I was one of the people that gave comments on human bodies and research. Which one of the peculiar outcomes has been that they're now asking everyone whether they would like the state to pay for their funeral if they give organs when they die. Which, anyway, there you go. There's a point of contact. This is interesting. Anyway, I think that I don't want to throw altruism away entirely. I think that for many people it's doing really important work. I think the fact that it came up as being such a denuding, such a way to say that you people will give your eggs or give your cells, you'll get nothing for it, you won't get anything later, let me be sure and specify all the ways in which you'll get nothing for it, which is what these model consents do. And of course they're a lot better than the ones before, which didn't say that they wouldn't get anything, and so somebody could challenge them in some way of looking at it. So partly, again, it's to go back to Lucy's thing, and at times it seems absolutely new that something is going on that's just unbearable, and then there is an exhortation to reattach reciprocity to the gift. But at other times, it seems to be redeemed and still a thing that seems very important to keep. So new, old moral economy, I'm not sure, but definitely multiple and emerging moral economy is not even stable to the extent that egg donation and IVF is. Thank you. Maggie.
It's a related question about what you think might account for the difference in the state of California, for example, the comfort with commercializing embryos and sperm versus the discomfort of, versus the the script of altruism. And I think that there's obviously still discomfort with the former. For example, Canada has a moratorium on commercialization, and yet that's being eroded. In practice, it's eroded all the time. And I also have the sense that there's just a kind of growing public acceptance of the erosion, put it that way. So other than the obvious difference between discomfort commodifying an infant that might be a result from commodification of gametes, what would you account, or how would you say, or what can you say about what accounts for the difference?
So it's a huge question, but eggs in IVF, to some extent they've inherited this wonderful affective and economic double whammy of the double private, that they're in people's private lives, and lots of people want them there because people don't want that reproductive choice taken away, and some don't want anyone in the bedroom or whatever it might be. And the private sector, that's again is a huge. There's a lot behind that, but and people, it's considered, donating eggs is considered to be. There's a very, very stratified market in who can afford reproductive technologies to start with in the country. And so ability to pay in some way ups the ante. And giving to eggs is considered to be very arduous and to involve considerable risk. And scarcity is a figure that looms all the time. Scarcity looms around the research too. But you wouldn't get an egg donor. But I do want to say a couple of, so there are various reasons why eggs are paid for in the US. Mostly the main reason is that it's not bad. It's not illegal to pay for them. So a market has emerged. But those are the main reasons. The reason why no market has emerged around eggs although markets are now emerging around eggs for stem cell research, is that people didn't want, especially in California, they didn't want, you couldn't pass a proposition that said in it, we will pay women to give up their eggs. There wasn't the information on the risks associated with it, which the women's health movement has been really, really helpful in bringing to light. The Institutes of Medicine did a report and is beginning to collect long-term data. But it just wouldn't have been politically acceptable. And when I've asked the people who drafted Proposition 71, for example, why that wasn't considered there, it is the possible association with buying and selling of babies, with its associations with slavery, and so being absolutely beyond the pale of what can't be commercialized, and then the idea that you would just be paying for bits of people's bodies, and people were acutely aware too that these were only women's bodies. That at the point before there was use of pluripotent stem cell lines, that people were going to need these eggs for if they were going to do these procedures, that this constitutional amendment in California was making it a constitutional right to do, that you were going to need women's eggs for it. And then as I said in the talk, the women's groups also didn't want women to be paid because they just basically didn't want women undergoing the risk of that research for stimulation contracts, I would say. So those things kind of came together. The markets are emerging, though. People are saying that we can't get enough eggs, and so we should pay, or we should egg share. You have some eggs for your IVF treatment. That's something that in the UK, and you give some to research. Myself, personally, I've argued strongly in the past against blurring reproduction and donation for research. But in practice, it seems to be that in England, it's working out okay, I would say, from the most recent research I've seen on it. It's working out in characteristically English ways, okay and not okay ways. So yeah, sorry to not be able to.
So, Lorna, you had a question?
It's a gift and you get paid. Looks like a contradiction in terms. Looks like a blend or a hybrid between the logic of gift exchange and the logic of a commodity. And I mention that because I teach a fourth-year course, and I give people on gift and sacrifice. My students produce an applied paper on gift. And one of the things that they dig in on is the existence of strange gift commodity economic hybrids in their lives. So it just puts into the full light at this point. With respect to altruism, another one, I get your patience, but I think the Canadian Blood Supply, for instance, has an altruistic form. It basically, I wouldn't want to destabilize that, partly because it encourages communitarian behavior among Canadians, and that is rather stressed. We want to have less of it. You know, and it's also a kind of communal property, as distinct from gift and life. That's the third term. And communal forms of property, of course, keep breaking out in resistance to both gift and special to life. So, absolutely. So then the analysis, you're doing gift as an alternative to communal and to commodity economic forms. But my concern, right, it's a middle term, it's third term. Okay? Excellent. But I guess I caution you, or I'm a bit nervous about destabilizing communal forms.
Yes, thank you. And people are debating. I mean, some people assure me that every gift always was hybrid. There's no more now than there were today, and so that there ever were. And some people do say that these kinds of entities of gift, commodity hybrids have really proliferated recently, and that human biologics is one of the regions in which they're maximally proliferating right now. And I don't know who's right on that, but certainly what I notice is that when people generally act as, and I'm very empirical, so when people generally act as if the gift and that it is a gift and they're being paid for it, they're usually doing all kinds of things to keep that separation, to make and mark that separation. Sometimes one of the theses that's kind of hidden in there somewhere is that affect is doing enormous work in this particular realm, and other people have argued that too. But it's not, you will not be selected as an egg donor if you walk in and you say, I want to get money. If you walk in and say, I want to help a woman have a baby, and they, through your psychological evaluation, that turns out to be true, and you need to pay all of your fees. So say you're in one of those wonderful niches where eugenics is extremely desirable and temporarily poor, like if that's other thing, as it were. One of my Freudians. But yeah, then you become, but you literally, and one of the most common complaints to this ask an egg donor inside is they write and say, why was I rejected? Why didn't I get through the screening? What was wrong with me? And often it's medical stuff. Often it was, I told them that my dad was a drunkard, but I'm not. Oh, dad's a drunkard, but I'm not. But sometimes you need to be clear, like, you also need to be not too needy. You have to show that you're not attached in all kinds of ways, and that's all that's not that. The willingness to be alienated, the willingness to move to a fungible form of recompense that's one-off and direct. But you will have to know that that's not economic, it's light economic. And one of the things that most surprised me was how actually good, when you're in the situation, people host this if you ask them about it. They do all kinds of photo oppositions. You ask them directly about it. But when people are actors inside, people are really, really subtle about which kind of exchange they're engaged in and who needs to be behaving how to be having this exchange. I mean, if you just think about it, people are very, very, very good about talking about who did what for who, and being very subtle about it, in ways that really, continue to surprise me. I must say, move me. And the communitarian thing, I mean, that point is super, super well taken, and I was kind of referencing the British solidarity thing in that context. And one of the things that is really different, one of the things that the stereotype of the US not really having that communitarian or solidaristic ethic there in the biomedical context was being used in, if we can just make informed consent just about the individual, then it doesn't matter that now with stem cell research you can't direct your donation and you can't withdraw your consent. Because before you used to be able to say, you can use it for this, I'm donating for this kind of research, and and I no longer want to participate, so please pull my materials and didn't like what was going on. But so there is a terrible need for some kind of notion that people, I think that they actually exaggerated the fact that there's no solidaristic notion.
Well, in interest of time and also in given it's so late in the evening for you, Charis, I just want to thank Erin and Anna and Charis for all this wonderful, engaging ideas that we can actually carry with us throughout. Feel free to mingle after. We can talk if you want to come up and meet Charis. But thank you so much for your attention, and thank you for joining us.